In this PowerPoint, we're going to be looking at comparative advantage, which is a higher level only topic, although it is good for the standard level to at least to have been exposed to that, which we did in a previous PowerPoint, a brief one, where we talked about LeBron James, the basketball player. So comparative advantage, the main thing to realize is this definition here, and you could well be asked to replicate it on an essay or on a data analysis. So in essence, it's the ability to produce one good at a relatively lower opportunity cost than other goods. So in other words, you have some kind of comparative advantage when your opportunity cost is relatively lower than another country. I'll let you read the rest of this on your own. You can pause the slide. So we're going to look at opportunity cost ratios. So let's say that there's two countries. Now I didn't make this up. I forget what source this came from, but we'll have Utopia and Happy Land. And we're going to have these two countries produce only two products, hardware and software. With 1 unit of their resources, they can each produce as shown in Table 1 below. So Table 1 is their potential production of Utopia and Happy Land. So looking at what Utopia can produce, they can produce 200 units of hardware and 1,000 units of software. Happy Land can produce 100 units of hardware or 1,500 units of software. So we want to look at the opportunity cost for each one. So I'm going to look at, well, what is the opportunity cost of hardware for Utopia? So I want it to be for 1 unit, and we're dealing with 200 here. So I'm going to divide this by 200 to get 1 unit. If I divide the 1 by 200, I have to divide the other by 200. These are ratios. So divided by 200, and I get 5. Let's go through the same process for Happy Land. We're interested in what is the opportunity cost for 1 unit of hardware. So here we'll have to divide 100 by 100 to get 1. And then we'll have to divide the 1,500 by 100 as well, since they're ratios, and we'll get 15. So we can say that the opportunity cost for Utopia of 1 unit of hardware is 5 units of software. And for Happy Land, for 1 unit of hardware, is 15 units of software. So here we go. For Utopia, for every 1 unit of hardware they produce, the opportunity cost is the 5 units of software which they could have produced. For Happy Land, for every 1 unit of hardware they produce, the opportunity cost is 15 units of software. So who has the lower opportunity cost in terms of hardware? Well, we would see that Utopia would give up less, so Utopia has the comparative advantage in hardware. This means that Utopia, as I said, has a comparative advantage in the production of hardware, as for every unit of hardware they produce, they give up less software. This makes them relatively more efficient at the production of hardware. So we know that Utopia had the comparative advantage in the production of hardware. So we suspect that Happy Land is going to have the comparative advantage in software, but let's see, let's prove that. So we want to zero in on the software. We want to know for 1 unit of software, what is the opportunity cost for each country. So let's focus on Utopia first. To get this to be 1 unit, we have to divide by 1,000. Equals 1, and then as a ratio we have to divide the other by 1,000 and we get 1/5. Focusing on Happy Land with software, to get to see what it looks like when we give up 1 unit of software, we have to divide by 1,500 to get 1. We divide one side by 1,500, we divide the other, and we get 1/15. So lo and behold, Happy Land does indeed have a comparative advantage in software, because they give up less, meaning 1/15 of a unit of hardware, than Utopia would, because Utopia has to give up 1/5 of a unit. We can see this clearly if we plot the production possibility frontiers for the two countries. So I apologize, I don't have a ruler while I'm doing this, but Happy Land would start, so this is software here on this axis, hardware over here. And so Happy Land would go from here to here. That's Happy Land. And Utopia starts here and goes to here. Utopia. So if you look at it graphically, you can see that Utopia can produce an awful lot of hardware with giving up relatively little software. So they have the comparative advantage in hardware. And with Happy Land, they can produce an awful lot of software with giving up relatively little hardware, so they have the comparative advantage in software. Let's say that they choose to use half their resources on the production of each good. So in this case, they're not trading or anything. They've just decided to dedicate half the resources to each of the goods. So first of all, here we're looking at what their pre-trade consumption would look like. So this is what they're producing and they're consuming. So instead of, if we looked at it initially, if we went back to the initial graph focusing on Utopia, their options were 200 of software and 1,000 of software. And so if they're going to produce, dedicate half their resources to each, instead of being able to produce 200 hardware, or 1,000 of software, they're going to produce 100 hardware and 500 of the software. Just like Happy Land, their production possibility frontier was 100 units of hardware or 1,500 units of software. If we're going to dedicate half our resources to each, that will leave us with 50 of hardware and 750 of software. So this is no longer a production possibility frontier in terms of or. This is now what they can produce and consume in each country. So if we look at the total of this, we see that total consumption is 150 of hardware and 1,250 of software. So note, so this is without specialization. And also note that the production in this case equals consumption. So if we look again at the graphs of the production possibility frontier, where they can produce and consume anywhere along this line, we would have Happy Land producing and consuming here, and we would have Utopia producing and consuming there. So this is where the countries produce and consume without specialization. So without specialization and trade. And again, the axes, this was hardware, and along here is software. Now let's have the countries specialize instead. And if each country specializes where they have a comparative advantage, then we're going to get production as according to this table. So Utopia, we know, has the comparative advantage in hardware. So they're going to put all their resources to hardware and produce no software. Happy Land has the comparative advantage in software, so they're going to put all their resources into software and none into hardware. So if we look at total production, it is now greater than where we saw the total production and consumption when each country put half of the resources into producing both hardware and software. And where we're going with this is if the production is greater, we also know that the consumption will be greater because the production will, of course, turn into consumption. So how did the production is greater? Because each country has now only produced one good, and so once they've specialized, they will want to trade to get some of the other good, because what good is hardware without software and vice versa. The terms of trade, or the exchange rate that they will trade at, is going to be determined by the opportunity cost ratios that we worked out in stage 1. The terms of trade will settle somewhere between the two opportunity cost ratios to ensure that both countries benefit. So we see that Utopia would specialize in hardware. So we've got, excuse me, Utopia and hardware. They would be willing to trade 1 unit of hardware for at least 5 units of software, because that's their opportunity cost. If they were to receive less than 5 units of software, they might as well make it themselves. So in other words, if it costs them more, they might as well produce it themselves. Happy Land, we see, is going to specialize in software. They would be willing to trade 1 unit of software for at least 1/15th units of hardware. Again, if it costs them more, they might as well produce it themselves. So what would be the acceptable ranges to trade in? Well, we want to look at the individual opportunity costs. So we know for Utopia, 1 unit of hardware, the opportunity cost is 5 units of software. We know for Happy Land, 1 unit of software would be 1/15th unit of hardware. Let's say they settle on an exchange rate of 1 unit of hardware for 10 units of software. Well, to be able to look at both countries, I want to see it in terms of 1 unit of hardware and also in terms of 1 unit of software. So if we take the software and divide it by 10, and we do that on both sides, we would have 1/10th unit of hardware would equal 1 unit of software, just so I can look at it from the standpoint of both countries. So I've taken this ratio of 1 to 10 and turned it around and made it 1 to 1/10th by dividing everything by 10. Is Utopia agreeable to the terms of trade? So yes, because they're going to make hardware and import software. So if their opportunity cost for making 1 unit of hardware is 1 to 5, 1 unit of hardware to 5 units of software, and if they're getting 10 units of software instead of just 5, they're getting more than their opportunity to cost. In terms of Happy Land, are they agreeable to the terms of trade? Yes, because they are going to make software and import hardware. And 1 unit of software, their opportunity cost is 1/15th of a unit, but they're going to get 1/10th, which is more. Again, they're going to get more than their opportunity cost. So table with specialization and before trade. So just a reminder, we have Utopia making only hardware, and we have Happy Land making only software, and this is our total production and total worldwide consumption. Now they're going to agree to trade 75 units of hardware for 750 units of software. So, and again, that 1-to-10 ratio. So let's see now what their consumption will be like. So consumption table, consumption after trade. So let's just make this clear. We had Happy Land producing 1,500 units, and we had Utopia producing 200 units, and we got this from the table from before. So now in terms of their consumption, Utopia produces 200 units of hardware. They're going to trade 75 units away, so they're left with 125 units to consume themselves. The 75 units went to Happy Land, because that was part of the trade. When we look at Happy Land and software, they're producing 1,500, but they're going to trade away 750 units, leaving them with 750. And the 750 that they traded went to Utopia. So if we look at the consumption, it's 200 and 1,500, and just note that worldwide consumption equals worldwide production, and is greater than when both companies, than when both countries allocated resources to both goods and did not specialize and did not trade. So I'm referring to the slide a couple of slides back where we looked at if they allocated half of their resources to the production of hardware and software and did no trade. We saw that the total production and consumption was lower than with specialization and trade. Now if we look at the pre-trade PPF and post-trade consumption possibilities for each country, we're going to see something quite powerful. We're going to see that each country is going to be better off from specialization and trade, as now they can reach higher levels of consumption of both goods than was possible before specialization. So when we had these two combinations, we had Utopia having 125 units of hardware and 75 units of, 750 units of software. So roughly here for Utopia. And if we looked at Happy Land, they had 75 units of hardware, and again 750 units, so approximately here. And so these two spots are where they consume after specialization. And you can see relative to both of their production possibility frontiers that it has now exceeded their own PPFs, which makes them better off. But I do want to emphasize some students in the past have confused these new dots as being where they produce. No, this is where they consume after specialization and trade. So each country can consume, and I want to emphasize that it is consuming beyond their own PPF by specialization and trade. And this is at the heart of the comparative advantage theory, and it's very, very powerful. I'd also like to emphasize that and we'll look at this in class, for a paper 1 question on comparative advantage, the IB showed 3 exemplars, and the one that earned the IB 7 went through this exact process but with simpler numbers, and you'll see the simpler numbers on the homework assignment. But the student looked at the opportunity cost, looked at the production possibility frontiers, plotted them, and showed how consumption could exceed their own PPF. So consumption increases through specialization and trade compared to a situation of self-sufficiency. It remains the basic idea behind modern free trade. Despite these advantages, many countries still protect their domestic trade. And you may ask yourself why. We'll look at this as we carry on, and we also did an in-class presentation on why countries still protect trade. You therefore need to know both the advantages that arise from free trade and the reasons why protectionism still exists. I will leave you the balance of the slides to read on your own, but in essence, we want to be careful that while comparative advantage theory is very, very powerful, it does not explain all changes in trade patterns. So please read the rest of the slides for this presentation. Thank you.